Thank you very much for that introduction, and to the scientific committee for inviting me to present today. Good morning, everyone. These are my disclosures. Unfortunately, we all know that Canada is not on track for hepatitis C elimination. And while we may reach our mortality indicator by 2030, modeling studies have shown that our ability to reach our incidence indicator will actually take us all the way to 2060. In May 2019, CanHepC released its first blueprint with objectives and targets for 2025 and 2030. They outlined 5 priority populations and 1 birth cohort of interest. One of these priority populations was people with experience in the prison system, and arguably one of the main reasons why we're not on target to eliminate hepatitis C is because this population has been neglected from many hepatitis C efforts in Canada. Why is this population so important? Firstly, the hepatitis C antibody prevalence is estimated to be 25% in both federal and provincial and territorial prisons. With the hepatitis C antibody prevalence of 0.7% in the general population, this represents an antibody prevalence that is 40-fold higher than the Canadian general population. Furthermore, 20% of Canadian inmates report a history of injection drug use prior to incarceration and likely thereafter, serving as stimuli for ongoing hepatitis C transmission. Importantly, 1 in 9 Canadians infected with chronic hepatitis C spends time in a correctional facility each year, which means that correctional settings offer a unique opportunity to engage high-risk individuals in hepatitis C care. Where do we ultimately need to be? The blueprint set out quite lofty goals, and we will be addressing each of these in the next 20 minutes. Let's start off by talking about the burden of hepatitis C in our correctional facilities in Canada. First, so that we're all on the same page, there are 2 types of correctional facilities, federal versus provincial and territorial, and the main distinguishing feature is the duration of sentence, whereby inmates sentenced in federal custody have sentences of greater than or equal to 2 years, while those in provincial and territorial prisons are less than 2 years. With daily counts of 15 to 25,000 in federal and provincial and territorial prisons respectively, and doing the math, this accounts for approximately 2,700 and 4,400 inmates per day respectively with chronic hepatitis C in each facility. The hepatitis C care in federal prisons is assumed by Correctional Service Canada, while you'll see in the provincial and territorial prisons is not uniformly assumed by the Ministry of Health, which can have detrimental effects on the provision of health care in and of itself. There's a lot to be learned from hepatitis C care in federal corrections, and this is sort of one of our success stories. Opt-out STBBI screening was introduced in federal prisons in Canada in 2014, which occurs within 24 hours of admission and then follows a risk-based practice during incarceration. You can see on the left-hand graph that with the introduction of opt-out screening, that the uptake of hepatitis C went up to 96% in 2016. In addition, in May 2017, federal corrections removed all fibrosis restrictions, and now, since then, all inmates who qualify for DAAs have access and are treated. You can see on the right-hand side, the prevalence, the hepatitis C antibody prevalence in 2007 was approximately 30%. And with a slew of testing and treatment modalities, in addition to harm reduction measures, the antibody prevalence decreased to 5% in 2018. Note that this is the antibody prevalence and not the RNA prevalence. However, it's a decent surrogate marker. I've been working in this field for approximately 2 years now, and I realize that we know very little about what happens regarding hepatitis C care in provincial prisons. So we devised a questionnaire that looks at every step along the cascade of care to better determine what happens in provincial prisons in terms of hepatitis C care practices and what are the barriers to hepatitis C care. This was a national collaboration. Many of you are in the audience, and I thank you for your efforts. This questionnaire was sent to each of these individuals who represented their provinces respectively and were responsible for then disseminating the questionnaire to each provincial prison in their respective provinces. These are our results. So over a 3-month period that ended just at the end of January, we had response rates of over 50% among our provincial prisons. Note the excellent 100% response rates from British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec. We didn't do so well in Ontario due to troubles with REB, which was not required in other provinces, and along the East Coast for various reasons. However, this is the first time this has ever been done in Canada, and we continue to harass Ontario and the East Coast to get on board. If anyone can help me, I'd be greatly appreciated. So we're going to actually take a look at the responses of the questionnaires with respect to each blueprint recommendation that was outlined. So the first recommendation for people in prison is to routinely offer voluntary confidential hepatitis C testing at prison entry and during prison stay. So this alludes to either an opt-out or an opt-in approach. So what actually happens in Canada? So each of those circles represents geographically where the provincial prison is located in each province. You can see here that in Saskatchewan, 2 provincial prisons offer no hepatitis C screening. On demand, i.e. an inmate must request hepatitis C screening during his or her incarceration, is the grand majority of the country, with 18 or 38% of provincial prisons reporting this type of screening pattern. Risk-based 8 or 17%, opt-in 11 or 23%, and opt-out Alberta, we're proud of you, and that 1 provincial prison in British Columbia for opt-out screening. The take-home message, though, is that there's different colors throughout the map, which means that there is great heterogeneity throughout the country and within each province in and of itself. What else did we learn from our survey? The antibody via venipuncture is the only test that's used. Reflex RNA and genotyping is currently not the standard of care, and therefore multiple visits are required to make a diagnosis of chronic hepatitis C in prison settings. The turnaround time for the antibody ranges between 2 and 4 days, for the RNA 1 to 4 weeks. And when asked about barriers to hepatitis C screening, the most common responses we got was the on-demand screening approach, low inmate awareness or knowledge, and a lack of dedicated personnel. I really wanted to understand whether on-demand screening was that detrimental to screening rates. So we characterized the hepatitis C care cascade among people in Quebec's largest prison, known as Bordeaux, over a 1-year period. You'll see that the y-axis is split from 5,000 to 400. And so among the 5,000 individuals who were sentenced during that 1-year period, 344 or 7% requested screening for hepatitis C, among whom 11%, so initially I quoted a prevalence rate of antibody of 25%. We see a lower prevalence of 11% in this prison. The good news is the majority were screened for RNA. A smaller proportion than what's typically reported in the literature of about 50% were RNA positive, 2/3 were linked to care, 1/3 were initiated on treatment, and 2 of the 3 achieved SVR. The take-home message, though, is that 7% of those inmates during a 1-year period requested on-demand screening. On-demand screening does not work. We don't need to do any more research in this area. We need to move forward. So if this is an area of interest to you, as it is for me, we actually followed our inmates at Bordeaux Prison for 6 months, and we looked at factors associated with on-demand screening, and I encourage you to look at our poster because there's some really interesting results that came out of this. Last year, I was funded by the Canadian HIV Trials Network to do a pilot study looking at the acceptability of the Oraquick fingerprint HCV antibody test versus standard venipuncture, again at Bordeaux Prison, where I do my research. During a 3-month period, we screened 280 inmates. We excluded all those who had prior hepatitis C testing. There were a bunch that refused, and therefore we enrolled 78, which were then randomized 1-to-1 to either Oraquick or venipuncture. You'll see among the 39 that were randomized to Oraquick, all 39 accepted, with the major reason for accepting the Oraquick that they preferred getting their results immediately. That wait time of 2 to 4 days is not favorable. However, in the venipuncture group, of the 39 that were randomized, 35, so the majority also accepted, with the 5 that refused, stating that they preferred not to have their blood taken from a vein. When you look at the two groups, they're relatively homogeneous, with over 70% history of drug use, 10% injection drug use. And when you look at the overall satisfaction rates, you'll see that almost 100% were fully satisfied with either test. Again, over 95% in either test would recommend the same test to someone else. And finally, if you were given the option, would you choose the same test? And you can see all of those in Oraquick said yes. And while there was some fall off in the venipuncture group, still the grand majority would also recommend this test. So what did this tell me? It told me, you know what? The acceptability of the Oraquick and the venipuncture are actually comparable. And the type of test unlikely explains the low hepatitis screening rates. It's likely driven by numerous factors, including lack of personnel, but foremost by the screening approach itself. The next recommendation that the blueprint made for this population was to provide hepatitis C treatment for all prisoners and or linkage to care upon release for those with short sentences. Does this make sense? Well, I am not a modeler, and I will try to explain this in layman's terms for all of you in the audience, except Natasha. This was a project that was led by Arnaud Godin, a Ken Hep C student, and together we paired up to look at the relative reduction in hepatitis C incidence from 2018 to 2030 among community PWIDs in Montreal when different strategies were employed in prisons. It's not yet published, but we're expecting it to be published, hence the premature IJDP. This model was calibrated with great data from Survie and prison surveys, and the 4 scenarios were the following. We test 90% of people in prison, and then we treat 75% of those in prison. Linkage to care, where we test again 90% in prison, but then link them to care upon release and treat 75%. And the strategies 3 and 4 are basically the first 2 strategies, but a post-release risk reduction. Think of this as an integrated program where it's either nurse-based or peer-based models of care to reduce the excess risk of hepatitis C acquisition and transmission once released. So the model was appropriately calibrated on the left, but I'll take you through the right, which is some interesting results. The top right-hand side looks at the status quo, which basically is our 4 scenarios. And you can see that in the best case scenario, we were able to reduce, there's a reduction in the incidence of hepatitis C in the community by approximately 50%. Let's look down one, where there's a simultaneous parallel response, whereby there's a community DAA scale-up. What we meant by this was that PWIDs in the community in Montreal would be tested at least once a year, and then if found to be chronically positive, would be initiated on treatment. You can see the gray line as the community DAA scale-up, and while there is a relative reduction in incidence by 80%, you can see that there is incremental benefit of each scenario on the risk reduction of hepatitis C, such that we almost reach 100% risk reduction by the year 2030. It's pretty impressive. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry that you can't see the colors here, so I'm going to have to skip. I'm not sure what's happened, but we can talk about that later. And finally, the reviewers had asked us, we assumed there was a seamless transition from prison to community, which we know that does not happen among this population. So instead of modeling different SVR rates, we modeled different treatment uptake rates. So you can see that even with a treatment uptake rate of 25%, that there was a relative reduction in incidence by 20%. And with our goal of 75% reduction, on treatment, there was a reduction by 50%. So this argues for a seamless transition and linkage to care programs. So what did we learn about hepatitis C treatment in this country? So there is a lot of gray on this map. 20 out of 48 or 42% of all provincial prisons in Canada have never initiated treatment in prison, which is shocking in the current state of DAA access. The remainder, 28 out of 48 or 58% of prisons have ever initiated. We just required one treatment initiation in prison. What did we learn about restrictions? Interestingly enough, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Quebec have the least restrictions, offering no restrictions whatsoever to DAA access. A smattering across the country has incarceration length as a restriction. There are fibrosis restrictions in Alberta and Manitoba, and even cirrhosis restrictions in Alberta, with other restrictions elsewhere, primarily a combination of incarceration length and fibrosis. Is incarceration length an appropriate restriction? Arguably, I would say yes, and it was important for a quarter of our prisons. Why is that? If we look at our sentenced inmates in provincial prisons, 30% remain in prison for only 1 week. They're barely getting their antibody. Another 30% are there between 1 week and 1 month. They're barely getting their RNA. Another 30% between 1 and 6 months. Who knows the proportion that actually are able to complete therapy during that time? And arguably only 10% are likely incarcerated long enough to undergo the entire trajectory to treatment completion and SVR. So rightfully so, you can argue that incarceration length should be an important or should be considered a restriction, and the blueprint argues that we strengthen linkage to care among those whose sentences are short enough. In terms of DAA coverage, we asked about this as well. The good news is that there's majority green, which means that the Ministry of Health covers DAA. There are, in Quebec, I can tell you at least that we're switching from one of the ministries to the Ministry of Health, and this is likely to happen across the country, whereby healthcare will be prioritized. There's a lot of challenges in prisons. I named just a few, but inter-prison transfers are common, unexpected prison releases, reincarceration, and I haven't even touched upon the remand population or those who are not sentenced. So this is another area of research that we will tackle after we do this one. In terms of linkage to care, we asked each facility, is there a standard of care to refer newly diagnosed patients with chronic hepatitis C to a hepatitis C specialist? You'll see that it's not uncommon that there's no standard of care. In British Columbia, they have a prison doctor who's responsible for it. There's an external specialist with care who comes into the prison, again, across the country, but the majority is in green, whereby inmates have to be transferred outside of their correctional facility to receive care and further workup. Linkage to care is an area that interests me. There's very little research currently focused on it. I hope next year I can present about a multidisciplinary care model that we're currently testing at Bordeaux Prison. We also looked at some of the barriers to linkage to care and realized that these are driven by the social determinants of health, which means that having a social worker who may address them upon release would be an interesting strategy. And this is an area, I think, where community collaborations can be key to ensure a seamless transition to the community. Finally, in terms of harm reduction, there is, we're all proponents of this. The blueprint recommended that we implement harm reduction program and policies in prison settings. This has been rolled out in federal corrections. There's bleach that's available in all prisons, although it lacks any benefit. There was a safer tattooing initiative, but has since been discontinued in 2007. With respect to OAT access across the country, the grand majority do have OAT access, which is a great thing. In terms of naloxone access, majority do not have access. Some have access at release only, and a very small minority have access both during incarceration and at prison release. Hepatitis C education is an area I think we are lacking in prison settings. And what did we learn about this from our survey? The first is that from the provider standpoint, over 50% lack knowledge or awareness regarding screening, so an area we can intervene. And almost 50% of providers also lack that appropriate knowledge in correctional facilities regarding hepatitis C care. As I mentioned, there's a role for community collaboration, primarily in the role of advocacy, but also a symbiotic relationship between the research design and knowledge translation. So if I could choose one thing, what would that be? It would be to implement and standardize opt-out screening across the country, recognizing that all cascade steps are dependent on this first step. There's also, I think, a role for peer support programs, and this was demonstrated recently in Ireland, where peer support screening was shown to be effective. We need to be, where do we need to be? We need to be in a lot of places. We're not there now, but we will hopefully get there. So unfortunately, I've shown you that hepatitis C elimination is probably unlikely, but I think what the take-home message from this talk is that there are major disparities in the provision of care in both federal and provincial and territorial prisons and within prisons. We know the evidence for how to eliminate hepatitis C. It's all about rolling it out. And I encourage increased dialogue among all interested stakeholders to ensure that this can happen as soon as possible. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the following people and thank you for your time and attention.